Dear Jesus, I really don't know what to say, either to you here in this prayer, or what I'm supposed to say after amen. I had a plan, but it's not feeling like your plan at the moment, and I don't know what your plan is yet. But something you've been showing me lately, and I really, really love it, is that no sheep ever needed to know the destination. The only thing the sheep ever needs to know is the shepherd's voice. You have been teaching me your voice. It sounds like grace. It sounds like freedom and peace. Sometimes even joy. Lord, there are a lot of hurting people here today. Women who are going through the toughest times in their lives, or whose lives are simply tough, and it's not a season, it's just life. And Lord, as someone who went through a decade worth of deserts where there appears to be no water, it's the hardest time in the world to worship. And here we are, supposed to be worshiping you, supposed to be singing to you, saying that your praise will ever be on our lips, and sometimes it is really hard to praise you. I think you have something very important to say to us today, and I want my mouth to be available to say the words for you, whether they were planned or not. In your name I pray, amen.
Amen. And I just want my sweet sister to know that she is among people who love her, appreciate her vulnerability. And Father, I know for someone who didn't know how to pray and what words to say, you showed up in a prayer. And I know you are going to show up with this very important message for our hearts. And we get to be evidencing you, guiding her. How cool is that? That you're going to be put on display. Oh my goodness, it just now occurred to me. You're going to be put on display through my precious sister who doesn't know what she's supposed to do. You're going to show up and we will worship.
Yes.
Wow. Amen.
Amen.
You. All right, I said I wouldn't need tissues until a snot started to flow.
Guess what?
The time has come. Okie dokie. Once upon a time, there were 12 disciples, mostly teenagers, generally not too bright. A lot of them were fishermen, and like many fishermen, they were a bit superstitious. There was this one superstition, which was common to the people of Galilee. They believed that under their fishing spot, under the Sea of Galilee, was the mouth of hell. That's how you get to hell, is through the Sea of Galilee, apparently. I have no idea how this rumor got started. I'm kind of envisioning, Timmy, don't go near the edge of the water. You know what can happen to you, right? And it just kind of snowballed. I'm not really sure how it came about. Well, one day, these 12 disciples get into a boat, go out onto the sea, and things start to go sideways. This is Mark 4, starting in verse 35. On that day when evening came, he, that is Jesus, said to them, as the disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Now, this was concerning for two reasons. First of all, it was evening, and I imagine that boating on the glassy surface that covers hell had to be scary enough in daytime. Night just seems like a terrible plan. And, well, there were 2 reasons. What was the second one? I forget. Who cares? Well, it was concerning for 2 reasons, and if you were to open my book, Worship and What It Looks Like, Volume 2, you can discover for yourself what the second reason was, because I have completely blanked on it. And so anyway,
Where can we find these books?
livingthetruth.org, Miss Linda. Thank you, Linda. Also upstairs, all weekend long. I take cash, check, or
Wait, where's the free?
This is not.
I don't casually throw around the word
yeah,
free.
I
I
know that
only use
word.
it when I mean it.
That's a great.
Salvation is free. Books you gotta pay for. Okay, so they're on the sea, leaving the crowd. They took him along with them into the boat. Blah 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 blah. Verse 37. And there arose a fierce gale of wind, and the waves were breaking over the boat so much that the boat was already filling up. If you were wondering where Jesus was at this point, he was asleep. Wearied from his journey, I'm sure. He'd had a hard day. Jesus was asleep. Now, I think at a certain point they realize, we are going to drown. This is very bad. We need a miracle, and hey, doesn't he do those? So they wake him up, or perhaps they're passing him a bucket, saying, bail with us, man. Either way, they say, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? And he got up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Hush, be still. Not a bad thing for us to hear as well, just saying. And the wind died down and it became perfectly calm. This is where you would think they would feel at peace, at rest. Not so much. They're thinking, who is this guy? They became very much afraid, verse 41, and said to one another, who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? So forget that story. That is not the story we're discussing today.
That's
I thought, what are you doing? This is not
the story you were expecting.
No.
No.
Well, you're finding your way to your path.
Well,
Anyway.
it's not the story, but it is the question. Who is this? Even the wind and the sea obey him. So now if you want to turn in your Bibles to where we're actually going to be spending our time, that's going to be Job.
I love that, Courtney. That was
Surely I marked Job. Tell me I marked Job. There she was. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. And then it goes on to discuss his family, his livestock, his riches. He was the greatest of all the men from the east, and so on and so forth. Verse 6, Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Dun, dun, dun. There's some polite small talk between God and the devil, you know, what have you been up to, that sort of thing. And then God said to Job in verse 8, God said to Satan in verse 8, have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. Personally, I think there is a time and place for bragging on your kids. This, not so much it. I feel like now the gauntlet is thrown. So Satan answered the Lord, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge about him? That has to be the origin of the phrase, a hedge of protection. Yeah. Yes, I've always wondered, where is that? That's where it comes from. About him and his house and all that he has on every side. You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased, blah, blah, blah. But put forth your hand now and touch all that he has. He will surely curse you to your face. Now, to the casual observer, it looks like God kind of got backed into a corner here. Like Satan has dared him, so to speak, and God, in order to save face, kind of goes along with it. It's what it looks like to the casual observer. So the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power, only do not put forth your hand on him." So Satan went to town. This bit I'm going to read out of the book. This will be page 116.
1 or 2.
Oh, volume 2.
We've moved on.
We have moved on to volume 2. Good catch, Mrs. Miller.
Oh, I was thinking 116. Did you say 116?
116, and this goes back and forth between quoting the Bible and then me, kind of waxing eloquent upon it. Let me back up a smidgen. Okay, I'm going to actually start at the last paragraph of page 115. Like I said, didn't really get this planned out. I stole the tabs from volume 1 to retab 15 minutes ago, so who knows what's happening here. Okay, bottom paragraph of page 115. Here is where we cut to Job's 10 children, all eating and drinking and being merry in the oldest son's house. If this were Job the movie, this would be in slow motion. The ringing laughter, the wide smiles, the too good to be true, something horrible is about to happen, slightly discordant music, until a great wind came from across the wilderness and struck the four corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they died. So far, Job knows none of this. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, a servant runs up. The oxen were plowing, the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans attacked and took them. They also slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Now, I don't know what Job's response would have been. Most of the time I go to Job 1 and I go to Job 38, but between there, we get a lot of information about Job's life, and all this speculation is based on those things. So I don't know what Job's response would have been, but he was intensely passionate about justice and would not have let the Sabaeans' murder of his servants go unanswered. He was well respected, a leader of his people both for peace and for war. So if he called for reinforcements to go and take back what was his, I expect the entire land of Uz would have answered his call. He cared about his neighbors, so surely he would have sent messengers warning them the Sabaeans were in the area to keep their kids and livestock close. But we don't actually know what his response would have been, because while the messenger was still speaking, another also came and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you." Once again, I don't know what Job's response would have been, but he was extremely wealthy and well diversified, so even if he did lose an entire flock of sheep, he was still solvent and wouldn't have to worry. He was also very wise and knew better than to put his trust and confidence in money. So I imagine he set something aside in case of loss so he could rebuild his flock the next year. But whether he would have done all that or not, I do not know, because while the messenger was still speaking, another also came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 bands and made a raid on the camels and took them and slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." I don't know what Job's response would have been, but his heart broke when other people were suffering, so I half imagine he would have consoled that servant immediately for losing so many friends. He treated all his servants with dignity and respect as equals, so I imagine he would have put aside money for the families of those who died guarding his camels and ensured that their widows and orphans were cared for the rest of their lives. But we don't know what he would have done, because while the messenger was still speaking, another also came and said, "Your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking in the oldest brother's house." I wonder, did he even have to finish the sentence? By now, Job has to see a pattern. His 7 sons and 3 daughters were dead, and for the first time all day, Job actually gets a chance to respond. Folks, worship is a reaction to God on display. How do you react when this happens? Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshipped. If this were Job the movie, This is where things would turn around. This is where things would get better. This is where God would say, see, didn't I tell you, Satan, and restore all Job's stuff. But folks, it just gets worse. Starting in Job chapter 2, again there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. Same conversation, and once again, have you considered my servant Job, etc., etc., and he still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to ruin him without cause. We're going to circle back to that phrase, without cause, if I remember to do so. Satan basically says, well, sure, you took his stuff, but you left him untouched. Of course, he's still going to worship you. So God says, okay, he is in your power, only spare his life. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. He took a potsherd to scrape himself while he was sitting among the ashes. At this point, his wife has had enough. Curse God and die. His friends come, probably to offer some advice, and they see how bad he's suffering and just sit there for a full week without saying a word. I'm not asking for a show of hands, but I do want you to seriously consider the answer to this question. Do you like the way God comes off in this story? Because, the picture I have is like in one of those movies where it's maybe the Romans going to war or somebody. You've got the command tent and a table in the tent, and on the table is one of those topographical looking maps of the battlefield, and you've got the little toy cavalry soldiers that represent whole battalions of people, and they're kind of pushing them around with a stick, and they get a message, oh, that one's been wiped out, and they pluck it off, and it's like, God up in heaven moving the chess pieces. These are real people. Real blood, real tears, real death. 10 gravestones in Job's backyard after he lost his kids. And to the casual observer, God looks to be playing a game with Satan, and Job got caught in the middle. There are a lot of folks who believe that the story of Job is in fact not a true historical account, but that it, like the story of the Good Samaritan or the prodigal son, is a parable. I think the reason they probably believe that is because it lets God off the hook a little bit, and that this didn't really happen. But folks, let me remind you what the purpose is of a parable. The point of a parable is to take heavenly concepts and put them in earthly terms. It is to take the invisible, impossible to understand God and make him a father who welcomes his prodigal son home, to make him a farmer who is sowing the seed that is the word of God, to make him a shepherd who lays himself in the doorway to protect the sheep. It takes God, the intangible, the confusing, and puts him in human terms for us to understand. The purpose of a parable, any parable, is to put God on display. So folks, personally I think Job is a true historical account. I think it for a couple reasons, but it doesn't really matter. Whether or not there was a real Job, this is the real God. In writing Worship and What It Looks Like, Volumes 1 and 2, I wanted to be as thorough as I could, as impossible as that is, on covering the scope of the character of God. I've got my favorite things about him. I'm sure you all do. We all have our favorite aspects of God. And it's easy to talk about God's love, and it's easy to talk about his forgiveness, and the fact that he became human and came to sit down by a well to meet Sam. That is easy to talk about. It is joyful, it is beautiful, it is wonderful. But I don't want to leave out something important about God just because it's hard to talk about or hard to believe. And yet, folks, I am not discussing the tougher aspects of God because, well, that's who he is, deal with it. that is not why I say this. I say this because during my many years of depression and feeling suicidal, this book that I knew so very well became more and more confusing, more and more mysterious. Pieces of it were just gone from me so that I understood nothing until there was one passage left that comforted. I mean, people would quote verses to me that would comfort their hearts, never worked for me. It all just became meaningless words except one passage. It was Job. And folks, I believe that there is no more important thing to know about God when you're suffering than this. And we all suffer at some point or another, whether it's right now or not. I don't say this to be theologically correct. I say this to be comforting. This is who God is. This is who Job needed to see. This is what Job needed to understand. This is who I needed to see and what I needed to understand. And this is what kept me going. This is the only side of God I saw for years and years and years. And it was all I had to hang on to. So that is why you're here. So Job's friends, they were nice and comforting for about 7 days, and then they could not hold their tongue anymore. Because clearly what this situation called for was their 2 cents. So we could go through all 35 chapters that come next, but I'm thinking that's going to take forever. So let me sum up. Collectively, they arrived at this conclusion. I don't know what you did, Job, but this is somehow all your fault. And I suspect that none of us believe that in our head, that our suffering, that when bad things happen to us, it's our fault. I think we know that's not so, but we still feel it so. My life is falling apart. What did I do wrong? How did I offend God? What did I do wrong? Where did I go wrong? And poor Job felt the same way. His view of God was that God rewards the righteous and he punishes the wicked. So while Job's friends took that view of God as Job must have messed up, Job knew himself. He knew he hadn't done all these things that he could have sinned in, and so he felt like God had wronged him. So he is left with confusion, with questions, with anger, to be perfectly frank. And finally, when everybody's run out of words, and it takes them quite a while, God shows up. This is Job 38. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, okay, if this was Job the movie, we need to go to the deleted scenes, because this moment, when the Lord answers Job out of the whirlwind, folks, David describes it so much better, okay? So let's go there instead. Or let me go there and you just keep your finger in Job 38, whichever. This is Psalm 18. Oh, this is confusing. I always read this off my phone. I'm going to read it off my phone because my brain is going to melt. Okay.
Don't melt.
Don't melt. No, we don't want to do that. Okay, I have some of this highlighted, and that's, yeah, it just looks foreign on that page. Okay, so this is a Psalm of David, and he says in verse 4, the cords of death encompassed me. Verse 5, the snares of death confronted me. In my distress, I called upon the Lord and cried to my God for help. Now here's what I'm picturing. God in heaven, not that I can actually picture that, but bear with me, ruling over the affairs of men, and in the conference room from which he does all of his heavenly business, he hears, as if a small child tugging on the hem of his robe, and says to the angels, I'm sorry, this will have to wait, one of my kids needs me. And cried to my God for help. He heard my voice out of his temple. My cry for help came into his ears. Oh, buddy. Then the earth shook and quaked, and the foundations of the mountains were trembling and were shaken because he was angry. He bowed the heavens also and came down with thick darkness under his feet. Verse 13, the Lord also thundered in the heavens. The Most High uttered his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. He sent out his arrows and scattered them, lightning flashes in abundance and routed them. Verse 16, he sent from on high. He took me. 19, he rescued me because he delighted in me. Okay, so take all of that and put it into the phrase, then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. And said, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? That happens a lot, doesn't it? We're trying to make each other feel better in our sufferings, and we just end up with a lot of words without knowledge, and it just darkens counsel. Now gird up your loins like a man. I believe that's in the modern vernacular, put your big girl panties on. I will ask you, and you instruct me, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who set its measurements? Since you know, I mean, you can hear the sarcasm, right? Let's see, verse 12. Have you ever in your life commanded the morning and caused the dawn to know its place? Verse 16, have you entered into the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you? Have you understood the expanse of the earth? Tell me, if you know all this. I like verse 21. You know, for you were born then, and the number of your days is great. Not so much. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for a time of distress, for the day of war and battle? I love verse 25. Who has cleft a channel for the flood, or a way for the thunderbolt? That would be God. 31, can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the cords of Orion? Can you lead forth a constellation in its season and guide the bear with her satellites? Do you know the ordinances of the heavens or fix their rule over the earth? Verse 36, who has put wisdom in the innermost being or given understanding to the mind? Folks, I think it's worth answering these questions. Who did lay the foundation of the earth? This is page 125, if anyone cares. God did not build on something, a foundation created by another. God built on nothing. Okay, and folks, it's not simply that the earth had no foundation to sit on, our tiny blue dot hanging out there in space, supported by nothing. It's beyond that. Before God created, there was not even such a concept as gravity, or whatever force it is that holds things together, keeping atoms from flying apart. And while science has explained gravity, we still have no understanding of that other force. So last I checked, scientists are still calling it the God particle. Who laid out the earth's measurements? Before God created, there was no such thing as distance or size. And yet God determined the precise size our planet should be so that we would neither be squished nor suffer from astronaut-like bone deterioration. The precise distance from the sun so we would neither freeze nor burn. The precise speed at which we travel so that our years would be the right length for planting and harvesting. Where is the way to the dwelling of light? Even today, scientists cannot explain light. So that's the most obvious, simplest, but they can't explain it. Particles and waves and a bunch of other sciencey things I can't even name, let alone explain. I don't even know what I don't know here. But I know that we don't know it. No one has a theory to explain light. And yet every day God commands the morning, and explainable or not, here it is. Another verse in Job 38, water becomes hard like stone and the surface of the deep is imprisoned. Do you have any idea how important that is? Okay, so every other substance, when it goes from a liquid to a solid, it contracts and therefore becomes denser and therefore it sinks. Water, when it goes from a liquid to a solid, turns to ice, it expands and therefore becomes less dense and therefore it floats. Folks, if ice sunk, then the water on the surface of the ocean would freeze and sink, and the entire ocean would freeze up. There would be no life on planet Earth if this particular thing, if water did not become hard like stone and the surface of the deep is imprisoned instead of like from the bottom up. And God is talking about this for some 1,000 years ago, and no, this is why when they look for alien life, they look for water, because water is just really important. Is it by your understanding that the hawks soar? For the longest time, folks tried attaching flapping wings to airplanes to make them fly. Then one day, the brothers Wright were staring up at hawks and thought, let's try that. Just the fixed soaring. And God figured that out from the dawn of time. And thousands of years after Job, our understanding finally caught up. Who has cleft a channel for the flood or a wave for the thunderbolt? Folks, did you know before lightning can strike, the electrons in the atmosphere have to line up a channel for it, a way for the thunderbolt, all the way from the cloud to the ground. The electrons have to line up and then it strikes. It's just so cool. This was, by the way, all I really remember from science in school is the stuff that's cool about God. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow? Have you seen the storehouses of the hail? Who can count the clouds by wisdom or tip the water jars of the heavens? Can you lift your voice up to the clouds so that an abundance of water will cover you? Can you send forth lightning so that they may go and say to you, here we are? Or who enclosed the sea with doors? I placed boundaries on it and set a bolt and doors, and I said, thus far you shall come, but no further, and here shall your proud waves stop. Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. God, as he described himself to Job, is the maker of the storm. He tips the clouds so they make rain. He carves the path. He lets loose the wind. He is the maker of the storm. So what do we do when the storm comes against the four corners of the house and it collapses on the young people and they die? What do we do then? There's a lot of debate about whether God causes bad things to happen, or whether he permits bad things to happen, just kind of takes his hands off and it happens without his doing it. Arguably, one of the best evidences that God doesn't directly cause bad things, but rather hands off lets bad things happen, would be the story of Job. I mean, Satan goes to God, asks for permission, God gives his permission, and then Satan goes to town. And yet, the servant who said fire from heaven came down, Job said to his wife, shall we accept good from God and not also accept adversity? And then Eliphaz, one of Job's friends, in Job 5:18, he's describing God and he says, for he inflicts pain, but he also heals. Wait, he inflicts pain, but he gives relief. He wounds, and his hands also heal. To be fair, that's Eliphaz. I wouldn't really want to give too much credibility to him. He was pretty much just, talking to hear himself talk. But then we have Hannah, mother of Samuel, who in 1 Samuel 2:6-7 says, the Lord kills and makes alive. The Lord raises up and brings low. The Lord makes poor and rich. Then we've got Hosea, who is an actual prophet of God, speaks on behalf of God, who in Hosea 6:1 says, "Come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn us, but he will bandage us. He has wounded us, but he will heal us." Of course, if I was going to take any human being's opinion of what God is like, it would have to be David, man after God's own heart. David says this in Psalm 51:8. "Make me to hear joy and gladness. Let the bones which you have broken rejoice." But to be perfectly honest, I will not be settled on the issue till God himself weighs in. And this, in a string of verses that I have memorized, I can't seem to get this one in my head, so I'm going to have to call it up and read it out. This is Deuteronomy something. 32:39. This is God speaking. "See now that I am he, and there is no God besides me. It is I who put to death and give life. I have wounded, and it is I who heal, and there is none who can deliver from my hand." I also love Lamentations 3:37 and 38, which say, "Who is there who can speak, and it comes to pass, if the Lord has not commanded it? Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that both good and ill go forth?" But my very, very favorite, Isaiah 45:7. "I am the Lord, and there is no other, the one forming light and creating darkness, causing well-being and creating calamity. I am the Lord who does all these." So if God, let me stop right there. Folks, I think that Satan would like to claim credit for half of all that God does. I mean, his original sin, he wanted to be like God. He wants to be worshipped as God. But I don't think Satan is under any illusion that he can pretend to be the loving, merciful, all-forgiving, gracious God. But I think it is reasonable for him to claim to be the creator of darkness, the bringer of calamity, the maker of the storm. God, that is God's job. That is God's doing. But if Satan, if he can't be worshipped as God, then he'd like to be feared as one. So how then, I mean, if all these verses, this string of verses, God claims direct responsibility for the bad stuff, then how do we explain the story of Job, where Satan goes to God, gets permission, goes to town? I would explain it using Psalm 119, verse 91. "You establish the earth, and it stands. They stand this day according to your ordinances, for all things are your servants." Folks, from the smallest electron to the furthest star and Satan himself, all things are God's servants. Satan is nothing more than a tool in God's belt to be wielded to the exact extent and purpose of God and no further. I love how God describes stopping the boundary for the sea. He said to the waves, "Thus far you can come, but no further, and here shall your proud waves stop." God has also said that to every harmful thing in the world. "Thus far you shall come, but no further." Because all things, the good things, the bad things, all things are his servants. The greatest tragedy in human history has to be the day that God died. I mean, the day that God died, the sun went dark, the earth split itself open, the dead rose from their graves in protest. I suspect that Satan was popping the cork on the champagne and doing a happy dance. God is dead and we killed him. And yet, folks, it was not, well, this is what God says about that day. This is Acts, I want to say 2:23, and if I can't find it, I'll just say it. But This is what God says about the day Jesus died. Is that it right there? No, it wasn't. Aha. This man, meaning Jesus, was delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God to be nailed to the cross by the hands of godless men and put to death. It was not a miscarriage of justice that sent Jesus to the cross, although there was a miscarriage of justice. It was not the betrayal of a friend that sent Jesus to the cross, although he was betrayed by a friend. It was not a weak official caving to the demands of a rioting crowd that sent Jesus to the cross, although that did happen. And it was not the workings of Satan, although he inhabited Judas, although he tempted the Pharisees to go after him. And I am sure he was doing his happy dance, and yet it was not Satan that sent Jesus to the cross. Jesus was delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God to be nailed to that cross and put to death. If God did not grease the wheels of corruption and injustice, if God did not pull the strings of liars and deceivers, if God did not hold life and death in the palm of his hand, if Satan was not a tool in God's belt, then Jesus would not have died. And I would not have lived. The greatest tragedy in human history is the greatest act of love ever demonstrated. But God demonstrates his own love toward us, and that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Greater love has no one than this, that he lays down his life for his friend. The greatest act of love ever was the greatest tragedy. And so I can accept every lesser tragedy as also coming from the hands of a God who loved me and gave himself up for me. And so with Job, I have come to the point where I'm able to say both of these things. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away, and blessed be the name of the Lord. This is God as he introduced himself to Job, the maker of the storm, which circles me back around to the disciples on the sea. If that were you, at what point would you feel safe? Was it at the point that Jesus said, "Hush, be still"? Me, not so much. I would not have felt safe till I was at land.
Amen, sister.
Yeah. And yet, who is this? Even the wind and waves obey him. Folks, the wind and waves didn't start obeying when they became still. The wind and the waves were obeying when the first raindrop fell from the sky, when the first cloud appeared on the horizon. At all points, God was in control. At all points, he was commanding the clouds, the rain, the lightning, and the thunder, and the storm. And at all points, they are his servants. If I truly understood that, I could feel safe in the worst storm. I could feel safe when my boat has capsized and I'm barely hanging on to it upside down on the sea. I would feel safe as I'm drowning because I know the maker of the storm and he loves me. When I was at my deepest suffering, I told you that Job 38 was the only thing that comforted. The worst verse, I think, was Romans 8:28. You were going to say that? But God causes all things to work together for good. That felt so hollow. But I think this might be the reason. Here is how I pictured God works all things together for good to be. There's an episode of the I Love Lucy show where it's one of the most iconic episodes. It's one of the most beloved ones. Lucy and Ethel make a bet with their husbands that they can do better in the workforce than the husbands can do taking care of the house. So they go out and they get a job in a chocolate factory. Honestly, if you're going to go to work, that's the place. I mean, I've been thinking lately, if I had to get a job, I'd bicycle past the Brahms. I don't know if you're not from Oklahoma. It's an ice cream place. And I thought, if I had to get like a 9 to 5, that's where I'd go. So, anyway, they get a job in a chocolate factory. And they fail miserably at every job they're placed in. And finally, the woman in charge brings them to the wrapping station and tells them, if you fail at this, you are fired. So there's a conveyor belt that goes across the room, and on this conveyor belt, little chocolates, they look like little chocolate kisses or whatever, are coming across. And their job is to pluck up the chocolate, put it in the little square of wax paper, wrap it, put it back on the conveyor belt where it passes into the next room to be boxed. If a single piece gets past them, they're fired. So at the beginning, this is all fine and dandy, you know, just moving right along. They're plucking, oh, this is good, look at us, beating the husbands at this bet. Well, then they start coming a little too fast, a few at a time, and they're kind of, you know, anyway, at some point, they're like shoveling it into their blouses, into their hats, you know. The woman's about to come in, and they're in the mouth, pretending it's all okay, and the woman thinks, oh, you're doing great, speed it up a little, and anyway, it's just hilarity ensues. This is how I always saw God works all things together for good. Now, here's where the analogy breaks down, because in no world is chocolate the bad thing, but okay, but bear with me, just for the sake of the metaphor here. The events of my life, the bad things that are coming into my life, the depression and the heartache and the loss and the confusion and the blah, 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 it's all coming into my life, and God plucks it off the conveyor belt, wraps it in a silver lining, puts it back on the conveyor belt. And in my mind, maybe at some point, you know, one gets past him, getting a little too fast. Is he really keeping up? Here's what I did not understand. God does not get involved in my life at the wrapping station. God planted the cocoa tree. God sunshined onto the cocoa tree, rained on the cocoa tree. I'm put in mind of the little cocoa tram in Hershey, Pennsylvania, that would take you through the entire life cycle of a cocoa bean. God was at every step. So when this thing gets to my life, it is not a bad thing that God managed to, at the last minute, coat in something, you know, some silver lining that maybe makes it okay. No. If it gets to my life, it is good all the way to the creamy center. Because God only does good work. In James something, it says, I'll see if I can find it. See if I can find James, first of all. There she blows. Okay, do I even know where in James this is? Okay, it's talking about, there she blows, 3:11. Does a fountain send forth from the same opening both fresh and bitter water? Can a fig tree, my brethren, produce olives, or a vine produce figs? Nor can salt water produce fresh. There's an even more apropos verse in Matthew, somewhere I don't know where, that says a good tree cannot produce bad fruit, a bad tree cannot produce good fruit. Folks, what kind of tree, what kind of fountain do you think God is? He is good, which means everything that comes from him is good. All the way down to the creamy center. And if we have just seen that God is responsible for all things, the light, the darkness, the calamity, the prosperity, all of it, then everything coming from God must be good because he is a good God. That can be hard to believe. That can be really hard to believe. And yet that is God as he introduced himself to Job. And when Job saw this God, his reaction was to worship. But what's interesting, folks, I think I often picture worship as joy, as singing, as something uplifting, encouraging, thankfulness, whatever. But when Job worshiped, he tore his clothes. He fell to the ground and worshiped. Tearing your clothes, that's what you do when you're grieving in Scripture. Job's grief was offered to God as worship. Previously, when we were talking about Mary in the previous session, she was crying onto Jesus' feet. He accepted that as worship. Her tears were worship to him. There she goes. This is page 133, and I'm starting in the middle of the second paragraph. Well, I'll start at the top of that paragraph. Despite whatever joy I might try to conjure up, or gratitude, or hope, or faith, all of which are good things, sometimes all I have left is grief, heartbreak, and tears. But when I am broken by an act of God, when I am broken by the character of God, even brokenness is worship. When God catches every tear of mine in his bottle and records them in his book, even tears are worship. When in my grief I acknowledge God as the one who gives and takes away, even my grief is worship. And when my eye weeps to God, not a drop is wasted. God doesn't waste anything. Absolutely nothing of your life is useless to him. Nothing of your life is wasted to him. No matter how many years you feel like you cannot serve him the way you'd want to, that you cannot worship him the way you'd want to. Nothing is wasted by God. And I would like to point this out. Once again, in between Job 1 and Job 38, a lot of stuff is discussed, including what Job's life was like before. I think I tabbed it. Let me see. That's not it. Okay, this is page 119, that big bottom paragraph. Okay, all of these sentences have footnotes. This is from Job, like 29 and 31. This is a description of Job's life. At the beginning of our story, Job's service to God was unparalleled. Job was constantly involved in his community, seeking out the poor to make sure they had enough to eat and something decent to wear. When he knew of an orphan, Job took that child into his house and cared for them with exactly the same level of love he did his own biological children. He ministered to the dying and those ready to give up hope. Widows who had no way of supporting their children would cheer when Job came by because he was always ready to help in whatever way was needed. He cared for the disabled, those society had discarded. If he knew of someone being unjustly treated because the system was rigged against them, Job took it on himself to investigate the matter and see that it came to a just conclusion regardless of a person's status. He was continually taking from his own flocks and herds and offering sacrifices to God. And when calamity hit, every one of those things came to a grinding halt. He could no longer care for the poor or the orphans or the widows because he was destitute himself. The very people he once pitied now pitied him. He could no longer lift up those who were ailing because his own health was completely gone. Every sheep or ox that he could have offered to God was either burned up or stolen. He had nothing and could do nothing. So did God kind of shoot himself in the foot on this one? I mean, this was his most productive servant on planet Earth. And what God did to him made him useless for service. But it put him in prime position to worship. This to me is the... This to me is the pinnacle, the thesis statement, the summation of the book of Job. Dare I say, the point of the book of Job. I'm not entirely sure where it is. I'll find it. Aha. Job 42, verse 5. Okay, let me lead up to it. At the beginning of Job's story, he served God like crazy, but his understanding of God was limited. God rewards the righteous, he punishes the wicked. That was all Job knew of God. And that to a degree is true, but it's just a small, tiny aspect of God. Then, all this happens, Job realizes, I really don't know much of anything. Oh, let me find that verse. Ooh, verse 42:3. Therefore I have declared that which I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. That really describes me as well. For so many years, I declared that which I did not understand. And then God shows himself to Job, the maker of the storm. And now Job says, I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. If Job's service was broad and his worship was narrow at the beginning, and at the end, after God did what God does, Job's service was non-existent, but his worship expanded, which would you say is more important to God? Your service or your worship? Worship. There are seasons when we serve a lot. There are seasons when we serve a little. There are seasons when we can't serve. In every season, we can worship. Whatever limits, this is 136, the second paragraph. Whatever limits I put on my God, I also put on my worship. If worship is a reaction to God on display, and I only accept certain aspects of God as being Him, then my worship is also limited. If God is the God of green pastures and quiet waters only, then I will only worship when I find my pastures are green and my waters are quiet. And when the road ahead of me changes and God is on display over the valley of the shadow of death, I will look up from that place and yell, God, where are you? And find myself lost and confused, my worship nothing more than empty words I no longer believe, offered to a God of broken promises. If God is the calmer of the storm, and He is, I will look up when life is peaceful, see Him on display, and worship. If God is maker of the storm also, I will look up when life is in turmoil, see Him on display even here, and worship always. If I wish to have no limits on my worship, then I dare not put limits on my God. Dear Jesus, thank you for being good. Thank you for being in control. Thank you for catching my every tear, that not a drop of it is wasted. Lord, it is hard when we cannot see what you're doing. But I pray that we will trust the God who is doing it. That we can worship you even when we are confused. That we can worship you even when we are hurting. That we can worship you even when we are angry because life doesn't make sense and this isn't right. And God, where are you? Lord, remind us of the greatest tragedy you ever orchestrated, and that it was for our salvation. Lord, I dare to say, get me to the place where when I see the storm clouds gathering, I rejoice because I'm about to see God make a storm. I rejoice because God is about to do something awesome. And because I know how to worship this God, frankly, I've had a lot of practice. Amen.